Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss ICC war crimes trial, which may or may not occur. The ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, has been trying to start a trial about war crimes that have taken place in Afghanistan, not only, of course, including the Taliban and Afghan forces themselves, but even U.S. forces also, because they've been, of course, involved in that country for a significant number of years now. Now, obviously, the United States has done everything it can in its power to ensure that that does not happen. And the latest move is a personal attorney of Donald Trump has actually traveled to The Hague, as Fatou Bensouda argues that this trial be started, to argue against it, of course, saying that this is against U.S. interests. And, of course, the U.S. is afraid that its actions vis-a-vis the CIA's involvement in that country as well will come to the limelight or will be spoken about openly, something that, of course, they would not want to happen. And of course, a lot of the victims of this violence that have taken place in Afghanistan want this trial to go through. They've been pushing lawyers around the world and united about this. And I just wanted to quote one of them. They've said that Americans have modern technology. Why can't they separate civilians from militants? And of course, we can discuss that at great length, of course, the challenges in such a country and trying to achieve what the U.S., at least on the outside, says it wants to achieve there. Let's discuss this all a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Dale Walker, who is an assistant professor at the American University of Afghanistan. He earned his law degree in international human rights at the University of Leicester in the UK and his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Wales, also in the UK. He's joining us now from Kabul. Dale, thank you for joining us today. What do you make of the U.S.'s opposition to any war crimes trial about Afghanistan even starting?
The U.S. is concerned that it is really a political process because in America they have a very robust judicial system, so they do not think that they actually need their soldiers or citizens to be tried at the ICC.
Do you agree with that, though, Dale? Do you not think that the ICC should be essentially looking at things equally throughout the world?
Well, the whole role of international law is to try as much as possible to see if it could be incorporated into domestic jurisdictions. We will have no use for international law if local courts try human rights cases. So I'm not saying that I necessarily disagree with the ICC for doing their investigations, but one has to be concerned that since America is able to do these investigations herself, that it may now appear to be more of a political process rather than a genuine search for the truth.
You know, I would have agreed with you, Dale, if it wasn't under Donald Trump presidency, right? Because we know Donald Trump just recently pardoned 2 U.S. Army officers who were facing war crimes charges for their actions in Afghanistan. That doesn't give much confidence to the rest of the world that the U.S. is even at this moment in time at least capable of really holding its serving members accountable.
Well, I do agree, but at least one can see that they actually had a trial. That is a separate issue, and that is based in American law, where the president has the power of pardon. So that is actually a separate issue, but you do understand that they actually went through a trial, and at least he was convicted on one count. Yeah.
Indeed. Okay, so then if we're looking at the ICC just for a moment, if I might look at the macro picture here then, what then is the ICC's role when it comes to global justice really then? I mean, every country then would argue, as you have, and I mean, I'm not arguing if it's correct or wrong, but I'm just saying that the ICC has a role to play, doesn't it, in global justice, and it would need to then supersede at some level every country just arguing, listen, we need to do what is in our political/national interests. We can handle this. We'll hold our own people accountable.
Oh, yeah, no, the ICC, indeed, it has a role when coming to getting justice for victims. The thing about it is that if people are able to be convicted under their domestic systems for certain war crimes, then we would never have had even the need for the ICC coming into place. We wouldn't have had need for the Rome Statute. There are some systems which are unable or unwilling to prosecute war crimes because maybe their judicial systems are not as sophisticated. And therefore, no, indeed, the ICC does have a role to play. So it will always have a role until we have until international law as we know it is really incorporated into most domestic jurisdictions where they can then enforce it on their own.
Because you are sitting in Afghanistan right now, Dale, I wonder what thoughts are about what the people around you, the citizens of Afghanistan, would think if the U.S. Would not be standing trial in this fashion at the ICC. Of course, we presume innocence until guilt is proven, and it's not like it's just the U.S. right that is on trial. It's also the Afghan forces and the Taliban. So, what do you think Afghans would make of this, considering they're the ones who are most pushing for such a trial?
Well, of course, I think most people, whether they're Afghan or not, but I can tell you the Afghans, they would like to see that this trial proceeds at the ICC. But the type of satisfaction they are going to get is really just more something we would see in a sort of truth and reconciliation arena, because the Americans will never turn over their soldiers to the jurisdiction. And if they are convicted in absentia, the Americans would still not turn them over if some punishment is assessed. So while it may be hurtful for the local Afghans to see that happening, the better option may be for them to lobby Washington so that any war crimes that can be proven would at least be tried in the U.S. federal system or the military justice system in the U.S.
As a final thought then, Dale, I want to go to something you just, because if the U.S. would not be willing to put its service members at the mercy of this international court, which is meant to be serving all of us, as I said, of course, globally, doesn't that in a sense show that the U.S. believes it is above international law, where it does not want itself to be involved in these ICC trials? And then it goes to that other argument, too, that the ICC has only really ever tried African leaders, for example, and then it's not for the rest of the world, the Western world especially, that feels it is morally above this court.
One thing that must be remembered is that America has never ratified the Rome Statute, and she, I believe it was in 2002, she even withdrew her signature after she signed it. So America is not part of the ICC. And although Afghanistan is, the rules does call that if a crime was committed in a member country, I mean, that was signatory to the Rome Statute, the ICC can investigate it. But yes, I do see that could be seen as a court that then is, and we've had many reports of that, where people say that this is just meant to go after African dictators, and possibly we'll see some Latin American ones, but not for the developed countries. I do share that concern, but again, international law, the best situation is where we can get domestic systems actually investigating and prosecuting this, and that is actually should be the goal of international law, is to get it incorporated in the domestic legal systems.
Very well, Dale. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we do really appreciate your time today and, of course, for sharing your insight on this. Viewers, this case of the ICC, and it's trying to just get this trial started. Pedraza has been at this for quite a while now, and she was rejected the last time around because the court said, as Dale there said in one of his answers, that it's not like the Americans will put up any of the service member to be held to account in an international court such as the ICC. So what's the point of even wasting the kind of money and effort that will go into holding this trial to begin with? But then that, again, goes to the heart of the question that I put to Dale at the end. Why would the Americans be above international law? Sure, they haven't signed on to the Rome Statute, and isn't that troubling to begin with itself? Because the Americans just essentially have proven to the rest of us that they believe that they are above international law. And can we really trust American courts to really hold Americans to account for actions across the seas in places like Afghanistan or Iraq or otherwise? There have been many cases of war crimes that haven't gone through. We've just had these two cases where Donald Trump has pardoned Army officers for their war crimes trials, for being charged, with war crimes. That is, again, troubling, is it not? America thinks it is above international law, above any war crimes charges at some level. Of course, a troubling precedent for the rest of us around the world who are looking at this from the outside in. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the U.S. role in Latin America. We've had Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, recently say that the United States will help, quote-unquote, legitimate governments in Latin America to prevent protests within those countries from morphing into riots. Now, this, many would say, is quite hypocritical of the U.S. because it supports, for example, protests or even, one would argue, riots in places like Venezuela or otherwise, those governments that are not U.S. allies and are a thorn in the side of the United States and have been for many years. But then for other governments in Latin America, they would want their respective, quote-unquote, friends to remain in office even in the face of protests. What does this mean then for continuing U.S. involvement and U.S. relations with a variety of Latin American countries, not just, of course, those who are traditional U.S. allies? Does the U.S. actually want the democratic rights of people throughout Latin America to be respected, or is it only really for those countries where the U.S. does not get along with the respective governments? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Emmanuel Gomez, who is a PhD in government and public administration. He's joining us now from Berlin. Joining us from Sao Paulo in Brazil is Raphael Lagnado, who is a risk analyst at Valores International. And joining us from Aberdeen in the UK is Lisdey Espinoza Pedraza, who is a tutor, politics and international relations from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Her research interests include Latin American politics as well as U.S. Latin American relations as well. Thank you to all three of you for joining us. Lisdey, let me start with you. What do you make of Mike Pompeo's statement? Does that strike you as hypocritical?
Well, I think it's not surprising. The United States has always followed a very selective foreign policy in Latin America. And this trend actually didn't start with the Trump administration. One simply has to look at the record of American interventionism in the region to further confirm this. The United States has either directly or indirectly intervened successfully to change governments in Latin America since 1898. Pompeo's statements are in tune with this policy earlier this year, and there is something typical in American foreign policy that is especially in Latin America, that is the fact of I will back you up now and I can be your enemy in the future. And this explains why the United States has very fervently backed up the self-proclaimed administration of Áñez in Bolivia, for example, and Guaidó in Venezuela. And yet it has completely ignored the violence that has resulted in almost 70 people dead in Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia combined. And again, these are all labeled as the unintended consequences to contain or restore the order in what the United States considers a democratic government. So I think, yes, it's hypocritical, but it's not a surprising statement from the American foreign policy. One looks at the record of American interventionism in the region.
Raphael, what are your thoughts on that? Because, this just creates for very confusing scenario, doesn't it, to understand what U.S. policy really is in Latin America. I mean, you're sitting in Brazil right now. I mean, I imagine that today, even though the U.S. is friends with that government right now, possibly tomorrow it may very well turn into an enemy.
Well, just recently we have had a situation where the U.S. has slapped up tariffs on the steel industry from Brazil and Argentina, and this caught the Brazilian government especially by surprise, considering it is a very ideologically pro-American administration here in Brazil that we have. So it's quite like our colleagues said, they have a very realistic policy of backing you up now and being against you in the future. And that is a form the U.S. has traditionally used to that and their disproportionate power to use to enforce their vision to Latin America as a whole. I don't see it. I also agree with her in that Pompeo's statement as nothing new in the United States policy towards the region.
Yeah.
Traditionally, you go back until the 19th century, the American vision has been one of guiding or protecting, which is an euphemism for directing the policy of other countries here in the American continent.
Okay, so then let me come in for a moment. Emmanuel, are saying that America doesn't really, as it says, want democracy to flourish in Latin America, that it's actually just after its own interests?
Yeah, exactly. I agree with the other ones, colleagues, about the policy of about high stick or Doctrine Monroe. All these ideas is really typical for the USA. It's really important to me to say U.S. citizens, not Americans, because I'm a Mexican, I'm American too. The Brazilian guys, Argentinian guys, all we are Americans. And they have the concept, because the name of the countries, United States of America, they are the only Americans, and they have the power to decide in other countries. It's really, it's obvious, and it's like all the time, it's the same structure, the same theories to say, okay, I have the power, I have the power to decide in your country about your democracy or whatever. It's important to talk about the Mexican reaction now when the Donald Trump administration Donald Trump say the enemies and the terrorists is in Mexico, is the narco traffics. It's really funny because now the customers are against to the suppliers. They consume all the drugs, they have the guns, and they make the troubles in America, in Latin America. So for me, it's pretty obvious what's the new strategy. They want to find a new enemy. They want to make a lot of troubles in Latin America to take the power as usual from USA.
All right, so then Lisdey, what kind of an effect does this sort of U.S. policy then have on Latin Americans themselves, the citizens of these respective countries, be they citizens of U.S. friends or U.S. enemies? I mean, I imagine at some level that this actually hurts governance, their economies, etc.
Yeah, I think that's, I agree with what the other two specialists said. And there is something that we have to remember about American policy, and it's that the American empire thrives on amnesia. And for decades, American military and economic policies and interventionism in the region have undermined democracy. There is something to what you were mentioning before about how eager is the United States to foster democracy. Democracy and stability in Latin America have always been undermined by American policies. This has created, obviously, power vacuums that have explained the current situation. The United States has never really been neutral. And all the effects that we're seeing in Latin America, the uprisings, the migrant crisis that has been there for almost a year now, this is all a result of a constant intervention of American foreign policies in Latin America. And it's the idea of, you're my friend now, but you can become my enemy in the future, and vice versa. And the Trump administration regarding Latin America, the whole attitude isn't that surprising. I mean, the Trump administration per se, they don't even remember what they said last week. So let alone actions of long-gone administrations. And the whole history of American interventionism in the region is inextricably linked to the current political and economic realities of Latin America. And this will continue to be the case in the future. And I think that is the failure of understanding in terms of American politicians and the American foreign experts is how the whole crisis that is happening in the region is actually linked to their own policies back in the 80s, 70s, 60s, and even up to today. The support that they have to certain governments, the backup that they have for certain governments, and then the criticism of Venezuela, for example, Cuba. Forget about the whole political and electoral realities of the country, but there has been this, especially with Pompeo's declarations, this idea of, Cuba and Venezuela are the instigators of anti-democratic movements in Latin America. So obviously, it will just continue to worsen the situation in the whole region.
But to be fair, then, Raphael, I imagine when Pompeo spoke about Cuba and Venezuela, that there are problems in those countries, right? But is it a question of that America should not be involved in those countries or should not be targeting those countries, and those countries' people should work out their issues themselves? Or do you think American interference or intervention or even quote-unquote help is actually important for example, Venezuela to find its way out of the current crisis?
Yes, well, Waqar, I just said it. The current governments in Cuba and Venezuela, they are far from perfect. They are far from completely democratic or beneficial to their citizens. That is not to say that the U.S. has a special right to intervene in those countries or to dictate their destinies. Pompeo has said that they try to help the opposition, the local population. That is up for discussion. A lot of the pressure, not on Cuba, but on Venezuela, actually has come more from Venezuela's neighbors. My government here in Brazil, the Colombian government, they are very, very opposed to the Maduro administration. And Juan Guaido has been elected by the population. So it's not, let's say, black and white. Of course, that doesn't give the U.S. a special mandate. And in all cases, any regime change would be better directed by the very population from those same countries.
Okay, so Emmanuel, U.S. says, and Pompeo said, that the U.S. policy in Latin America is based on, and I'm quoting him directly now, moral and strategic clarity. Now, talking about that moral part of what he said, do you think it's actually important for America to be involved at some level to ensure that, for example, again, in a country like Venezuela, that the Maduro government respects human rights, respects democracy?
Yeah, well, of course, it's important to respect for the human rights. This is obviously all the people we are agree with that. But this is the really dangerous in the speech of the USA political, because they mix the real situation, the real warriors for the world, like human rights, in the speech. But the speech it's different. They Donald Trump say, we will make great America again. Now, this is the idea of this guy. And I believe he wants to do that. That's the reason, because he needs to start new models to attack Latin Americans countries. The economy of the USA always is for war, to sell weapons or to make a new enemies. So he's thinking in this way, and that's the reason, because he wants to intervene in the other countries like Latin America, and this is the result to find resource for the new economy in USA. So it's a little bit tricky when he says something about human rights. Yes, of course, I'm agree with that. On many people that agree with that, but what human rights do you have in for example, in the jails of USA, or what kind of human rights when you make a jails for kids and families in the border for the immigrants. You're talking about human rights when you make that, when you separate the families from the Latins, for the Mexican, for the Guatemalan people, and the kids are in jails. This is not a human right. So we need to be really careful with the double speech of this administration, because the people, they never say that, but Donald Trump is a really smart guy. And I just remember one word, like the Mexican president, they say, so far to God, so close to USA. So we need to be careful with the double speech of the U.S. political.
Okay, so Lisdey, if we're talking about U.S. policies towards Latin America, and I'm going to hone in on the Organization of American States, the OAS, and the kind of power that America wields through the OAS on countries like Venezuela and others that it does not agree with. Do you think it wields too much power over Latin America, and that it should actually not have that sort of power through the organizations of OAS and otherwise, and that Latin America should actually stand up for itself really against this U.S. interference?
I think I fully agree with your statement. However, I think that's easier said than done. And this comes from the whole superpower status of the United States. And the interventions that the United States has had in Latin America, they didn't start recently. I mean, you're not talking as other regions in the world in which there has been intervention of the United States in the early 2000s. I mean, you're talking starting from the 19th century with the Monroe Doctrine. The United States has been linked to the Latin American economic, political, and social reality. And every single intervention of the country in the region, more often than not, have been deliberate and motivated by profit, interest, or ideology. So it would be ideal that the Latin American countries would be able to act a bit more independently. However, considering the superpower status of the United States and the influence that it has, and not only the influence in the region lately, but the whole the consequences or the long-lasting consequences of foreign policies in the from the United States towards the region, starting from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the interventions, they have lasted for decades in the region. So it's very hard for Latin American countries to actually act independently, even if they want to.
Fair enough. Well, we'll leave it there at that with Lisdey, Raphael, and Emmanuel. And of course, we do thank them for their time and their insight. Viewers, I'll be back with the same topic after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. We're continuing to discuss the U.S. role in Latin America, as we did with the previous guests. But we're going to discuss this with new panelists. We're now joined by Marieke Riethof, who is a senior lecturer in Latin American politics at the University of Liverpool. She's joining us now from Liverpool itself. And joining us from Toronto, Canada, is Alessandro Bruno, who is an analyst at Gulf State Analytics and Midasletter.com. Alessandro and Marieke, thank you both for your time today. Alessandro, let me start with you. What do you make of Mike Pompeo's statement about legitimate governments, i.e. U.S. friends in Latin America, and that the U.S. would need to help them to ensure that protests that are occurring within their borders do not then morph into riots?
Well, Mike Pompeo's statement seems to signal a return of the intervention of the United States into Latin American affairs, not necessarily for the best. Throughout the early 2000s, the United States was too busy disrupting the Middle East and Central Asia, and sort of forgot about Latin America. And in that period, we had the rise of left populist governments from Venezuela. Venezuela started in the late 90s, but then we saw a wave of these governments emerge in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and they started to initiate policies which were aimed at bringing back the state into local affairs, particularly as far as the poorest members of society were concerned. Now, a few of these governments, like Peru and Chile and Colombia, moved more to neoliberal policies, and particularly in the last few years. But with some apparent, at least superficial success. And now we're seeing the fruits of that superficial success, that not everybody benefited. And with the interventions, I think the clear efforts to remove legitimate presidents, such as we've seen in Bolivia, for example, signals a return of the role that we saw in the 70s and 60s.
Okay, so let me go to Marieke as well with the same question to you, Marieke. Do you think that the U.S. role in Latin America has been unhelpful? I mean, we can obviously list from history a long list of things that the U.S. has done in Latin America which have been unhelpful towards what it is claiming that it wants in the region, such as democracy and otherwise.
Well, in the U.S. role in current situation, we can characterize it in a few different ways. So one is that the U.S. Under Trump, following on policy developed under Obama, is developing multilateral approach. So in the Organization of American States, of coalition building in order to promote regime change in countries that the U.S. does not support, including Cuba and Venezuela. And that is one seemingly harmless approach to Latin America. But the U.S. has also been involved in supporting opposition groups, that particularly ones that oppose governments that are not in line with U.S. foreign policy. And this, of course, has been happening for decades, but we can see this continuing today. And finally, the U.S. foreign policy has also been, in terms of its intelligence, focused on prior knowledge of initiatives for regime change in countries such as Bolivia, Venezuela, but also Paraguay and Honduras in the last decade.
All right, so then, Alessandro, I wonder, why does Latin America continue to take this lying down, do you think, at some level? Because it's not just like we're talking about Venezuela and Bolivia and Cuba, for example. We're also talking about his insults towards Mexicans, for example, and how he treats them and how he wants to now label the cartels terrorists, et cetera. I mean, all of that is very insulting behavior, but yet it seems that through the OAS or other such organizations that it's able to even twist and turn Latin American politicians to its will.
Well, I mean, as Marieke said, the U.S. has historical links and deep knowledge of these states. I mean, it's been interfering in this backyard for decades. In the 50s, but long before that. So it has the entrenched interests, and much of the Latin American elite, left or right, has studied in the United States. So they have the elites of many of these countries have links to the United States. One of the big changes, for example, in Bolivia, when not Moreno, who's in Ecuador
Morales,
right now for some reason. Morales became president in 2005. He was the first Hindu, the first Indus native American to become president in any of these countries. So he represented not only a break between left and right, he represented an ethnic break with the traditional leadership, who's played that role in many of these countries. So we have connections between the elite and the Americans, business interests, and of course, where is the Organization of American States located? A lot of these places, along with the Inter-American Development Bank, they're all in Washington, D.C. So the U.S. has used these organizations to put pressure, particularly on Cuba, and then they've also used pressure on individual countries to, again, I think Cuba has quite a lot to do with this, because what many American presidents need to do is please the Cuban community in Miami and Florida and get their votes. And now we are in a campaign mode in the United States. So I think Trump is playing chess, and he's securing his base in key areas. So he needs to be tough on Latin America, particularly left-wing or left populist governments. So
talking about being tough, Marieke, I wanted to ask you, it's not like the United States is even being nice to its own friends. I mean, it just recently has placed tariffs on Brazilian steel and otherwise. So that, again, at this point in time, of course, we have a Brazilian government which, ideologically at least, is very much in line with what Donald Trump would want in the region. So the U.S. isn't even a very good friend to governments that are in line with U.S. interests, is it?
That's true. So in the Brazilian case, that's very interesting in the sense that Bolsonaro sees himself as one of the US's closest allies in Latin America, and also supporting US policies for regime change without military intervention, I should add. So I think the intersection or the influence of domestic and election policies in the US on US foreign policy towards Latin America is very notable. And this also includes the argument that the recent protest wave in Latin America couldn't have happened without foreign interference, which I think is a very problematic perspective. And we can also see that in Pompeo's speech. That the protests in Chile, for example, have been instigated by Cuban and Venezuelan agents. Again, these comments are popular, I imagine, among a public that is suspicious of these countries, but it's not a realistic assessment of what is happening politically in Latin America at the moment.
Talking about then what's happening politically in Latin, Alessandro, I mean, at some level, doesn't the U.S. involvement actually hurt good governance and obviously the economies of these respective countries? I mean, if we're talking about what's happened in Venezuela, at some level, again, we can all argue that there were issues, and then if that country had been allowed to resolve those issues on its own without interference, that may have gone better.
I think this is the main problem. Whenever you have intervention, particularly intervention from the United States, which tends to be ideological, and there's also a Christian fundamentalist component that cannot be ignored. For example, look at who's replaced Morales in Bolivia. And that is another tool and link that politicians in the United States use to appeal to local groups in election times. Well, this kind of intervention always causes an excess reaction locally. In other words, because of the American intervention, then some of the populist leaders become more populist and more entrenched, and the divide becomes deeper, as we've seen in Venezuela over the course of the 2000s, when George Bush Jr. Encouraged a coup. I don't know if you remember, I believe it was 2002, 2003, when Chavez actually was arrested for a few days and then reappeared. Chavez was Chavez. He was a military general with experience and a very loyal army. That loyalties in the army, that's not guaranteed everywhere. And in fact, this is what we've seen in what we're seeing now. And it will, I think these positions will deepen, and the chance of very problematic protests is definitely there. We've seen in Chile, 26 people died. Ecuador, I believe there was one person, but all these numbers, I think, are destined to increase. And of course, then there's pressure from Brazil, which is changing tune. With Bolsonaro, Lula has been released from jail, and I think he will reinforce the left populist ideas.
We'll leave it there for now. So we do appreciate both Alessandro and Marieke for their time today, and of course their insight on this issue. Viewers, as we've spoken to with all of our guests, all 5 of them that have spoken to us about this issue of the U.S. role in Latin America, it seems that they're all in agreement that the U.S. role has not been helpful in Latin America. And obviously, going all the way back to history, the long list of U.S. interventions have not helped governance, have not helped democracy, have not helped human rights in any respective Latin American country. And then on top of that, there are the U.S. presidents, the current U.S. presidents, insults towards Latin American countries, such as especially Mexico, about rapists and terrorists, etc., and the need for that border wall to go up to keep the Mexicans out. That all, of course, just adds to this atmosphere of dislike for Latin America, unless, of course, it's on U.S. terms. And even U.S. friends, Bolsonaro, so much of his political stardom was based on him riding on the Donald Trump wave. And now Donald Trump has turned around and tariffed and taxed his steel exports. What does that mean for U.S. friendship with Brazil or even allied countries in Latin America? We'll keep a close eye on that, because certainly this is not the last we've seen of U.S. interventions, continuing interventions, mind you, in Latin America here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.